Hi, everybody. Welcome. Folks are still coming into the webinar, so we'll give it another minute or so to let folks get signed in. All right. It looks like we have kind of slowed down with folks coming in, so we'll go ahead and get started. Before we get started, just a note that we do have live captioning available. If you need to access this, please click the CC or closed captioning button in your menu bar.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ACPA and ASH Presidential Symposium, Bridging the Divide, Addressing the Political Landscape of DEI Work and Scholarship in Higher Education. My name is Brian Hopkins, and I use he, him, and his pronouns. I serve as the Director of Convention and Events of ACPA, College Student Educators International. I am joining you today from the ancestral homelands of the Erie and Kaskaskia people.
And hello, everybody. Good morning from the West Coast. My name is Jason Gilbo. I use he and him pronouns. I am the Executive Director of the Association for the Study of Higher Education, better known as ASH. I am joining you today from the lands of the Southern Paiute. We are so glad that you're here today, and we're so thankful that you're going to spend some time with us today. And this group of fantastic panelists. I want to offer a brief overview of our Zoom platform. As I shared previously, we do have Zoom AI captioning available. Again, click the CC or closed captioning button in your Zoom menu bar. We also invite you to ask questions and contribute comments by selecting the Q&A option, which is available in your Zoom menu bar as well. If you have any questions for the panelists, for the host, if there are any tech issues, please put that in that Q&A section. We'll address as many of the panelists' questions as possible. They may do this in real time during their segment, or we'll also have a Q&A segment at the end. We also encourage you to engage in the chat by selecting the chat option in the Zoom menu bar. We encourage you to introduce yourself if you're watching this as an individual, or if you're joining as a program, department, division, organization. Please share where you're joining from. We also recognize that there may be a lot of activity in the chat, and that we may not be able to completely monitor it. So if you have questions or issues, please use the Q&A function to reach out to either Brian and I as hosts of the event, or for any of the panelists.
Additionally, we do encourage you to have the attendee workbook available throughout the Presidential Symposium to guide your experience, take notes, and review resources provided by our panelists. I will go ahead and drop the link for that in the chat in case you don't have access to that momentarily. In a moment, we will be welcomed by the ACPA President, Heather Shea, and ASH President, Ana Martinez Aleman. Next, they will then engage with our 6 higher education scholars, practitioners, and leaders in paired conversations. After each conversation, you will have some time to reflect utilizing guided questions that have been prepared by our panelists. And when it's time for those reflection activities, you can find those in the last pages of the workbook. With that being said, we would like to thank you again for joining us, and we are excited to turn things over to the ACPA President, Heather Shea, and ASH President, Ana Martinez Aleman. I am pleased to introduce the 2023-2024 ACPA President, Dr. Heather Shea. While working on my introduction of her today, I could not help but think back to the first memory of meeting Heather. Picture it, Sicily, or Indianapolis in 2013 at the ACPA June Leadership Meeting. At that time, I was fairly new to ACPA leadership, serving as an ACPA entity chair, and Heather was the ACPA 2014 Convention Program Chair. Even then, Heather's love for ACPA and her advocacy challenging higher education practice forward with a social justice lens told me that she would serve as the ACPA president. And just a few years later, here we are during a critical time when her leadership is essential. I am so grateful for her leadership of our association as we approach our centennial celebration, and for her dedication to advocating for more equitable campus environments for all students, as well as our higher education colleagues. I value how she is never afraid to ask critical questions or challenge me to consider new perspectives, and I know that many others can say the same.
Thanks so much, Brian. And I am excited to introduce our ASH 2023 president, Dr. Ana Martinez Aleman. I've had the pleasure of working with Ana now over the past 2 years in her term as president-elect and now president, but first met her at my very first conference as executive director in Portland in 2019. Admittedly, I was a bit quick to judge. This woman with a leather jacket and jeans was at an ASH conference, a place where I thought I had to wear a suit and tie. But we had a great convo that first year, and I'm grateful for her leadership and friendship over these past few years. I admire how she makes decisions quickly, but thoughtfully. She cares deeply about her colleagues, ASH, in the field of higher education. I also appreciate how she is a constant learner. If you haven't listened to the ASH podcast yet, please check out the first episode of our season 2 to get to know her a bit better, including her passion for cycling and her thoughts on social media, an area where she continues to do lots of great research. Ana and Heather, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jason and Brian. Greetings all, and welcome to the ACPA ASH Presidential Symposium. As Brian said, I'm Dr. Heather Shea. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am joining you today from the lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples, otherwise known as East Lansing, Michigan. Alongside Ana, Jason, Brian, and all of our esteemed panelists, I am so excited about today's symposium. We are here to address current challenges facing higher ed. We're going to focus on the political landscape, specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But at first, I want to tell you a little bit. The first ACPA ASH Presidential Symposium that I attended was that of my mentor, Dr. Kristen Wren, who was then the ASH president. I was so excited about the opportunity to hear from practitioners and scholars, researchers, and educators. I just love how this symposium brings together two associations that I dearly love, ACPA and ASH, committed to transforming higher ed. And it was really fun today putting together today's panel. Our theme, Bridging the Divide, I think is really underscored by the current situation in the United States. Policymakers and state legislators have showcased increasing polarization through attacks on DEI initiatives in both practice and scholarship. These attacks bear significant consequences, not only for our work in higher ed, but also for the very essence of our humanity and that of our peers and our students, both present and future. Despite our virtual format and the fact that we're dispersed all across the US and maybe abroad, we are unified in our purpose today. We are bound by a collective pursuit of a more inclusive and equitable future. And as we are examining this political landscape's attack on DEI work, I hope we keep that as our central focus. I approach this topic with critical hope that we can work together towards bridging this divide. So I hope that this symposium, grounded in our theme, serves as a catalyst for positive transformation and progress. And also excited to welcome my colleague, President of ASH, Dr. Ana Martinez-Aleman.
Thanks a lot, Heather. And now I'm sort of hoping that I can find my leather jacket close by so that I can keep up with a reputation, I guess. I'm not sure. Bienvenidos y saludos a todos. I am joining you today from the ancient, ancestral, and now still very historic lands of the Massachusetts tribe, which is part of the Wampanoag Nation here in the Northeast, and currently in the town of Menotomy, which now goes by Arlington, Massachusetts. ACPA and ASH have had a very solid working history together, and its history has been one about working together to address a whole myriad of higher ed problems, concerns, issues that, quite frankly, have always and will always continue to require collaboration between researchers and practitioners. The assault on DEI today, and likely in the near future, and the topic of our conversations today, in all of the ways that it manifests, right? In all of its manifestations: student access, student life, academic freedom, professional integrity, job safety, etc., is most acute today, and rightly demands that we think about our collaboration across all professional associations concerned with higher education's value propositions for our democracy. Today, in particular, ASH and ACPA band together to engage our guests and colleagues in a conversation about the implications of the current and near future political landscape that is, has, and will shape DEI practices, and the research that's needed to address the undermining of those practices. I hope that you understand as participants that we will ask our guests today to give us marching orders, to bring before us their perspectives on what is and isn't happening and how it is that we can act proactively with our collaborations. So I welcome all of you, and I am quite excited to begin the first panel discussion. So Heather, I'm throwing it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ana. So our first panel is really going to be talking about the landscape, what is happening. And I'm super excited to introduce Liz Lapolt-Clark, VP for Public Policy Research for the National Association of College and University Business Officers, or NACUBO. She is a well-respected speaker in Washington, D.C. on federal policies. And I had the pleasure of first hearing Liz speak at the Council of Higher Education Management Associations, or CHEMA, conference. Joining Liz is Brian Bridges, the Secretary of Higher Education for the state of New Jersey, appointed to his role in 2020. He works on developing policy for the state while continuing to serve in a number of other professional associations and work on higher ed projects and programs. So welcome, Liz and Brian. Thank you so much for being with me today. I think our first question I am going to launch into is, earlier this month, NACUBO released a report on the top 5 issues in higher education. I think we've linked this in our workbook. I'd love to hear from each of you. What is the top issue for higher education today? Liz, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I am going to clarify that NACUBO's focus was on the top 5 higher education business issues. So an important little turn of the dial there. And on behalf of our business officers who responded to this survey in July of this year, it was made very clear to us that their top concern is the higher education workforce. And it came through in many different ways. There are concerns about how to provide competitive pay and benefits, concerns about turning the dials the right way on offering remote and hybrid workplace opportunities and getting those policies right, reducing turnover in the workplace, and mitigating the impact of turnover. When there's turnover, it really impacts the workload of those that are still there, and how can they mitigate that impact of such high turnover right now. Developing talent that is already a part of the higher education workplace. So those are all elements to this workforce question, and that's what our members told us that they see as their top issue. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's an important distinction as business, but specifically around employment, I think that that's really a critical piece. So thank you for sharing. Brian, what about you? What's for you the top issue, either business or otherwise?
Sure, Heather. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate any opportunity to engage with rising scholars in our field. And I wanted to applaud NACUBO for raising these issues because they're definitely key to how colleges and universities operate. I'm glad that Liz made that clarification because they do have more of an operational kind of tilt, although the student pieces around successful student outcomes and affordability and enrollment management, as well as the workforce piece, are all amplified when the operational pieces work together well. But I want to add one more to this. And for me, I want to add to the list, because it's more of an existential issue than all of these others, and that is a fundamental value proposition issue. Now, with shifting public perceptions about the value of college and the value proposition of higher education is being challenged, and whether college is even worth it. Now, we know that the main drivers of this conversation are cost, and also part of that is clearly articulating the return on investment. But even more so, we have to be really careful about the ways we engage in the value proposition conversation or debate. I believe that having the conversation and questioning the value of college on the premise of cost is somewhat dangerous, because the conversation has the greatest impact on those who have not been able to fully participate in higher education in the past. And those are the individuals and communities that stand to gain the most from the opportunity that higher education offers. But for many of whom, the financial piece is the most insurmountable. And sometimes it's a psychic issue of surmounting that challenge as well. And it's those students that we can't forget as our society continues to expand in different ways. Those are the people that we need more of participating in higher education and taking full advantage of the benefits of it. So as we speak about these challenges and how higher education evolves and moves forward, I know that the workforce piece, to follow up on Liz's point, the workforce piece is part of that, because I think that employers are also questioning how well trained the workforce is as they come to their places of employment. But I think for me, the top issue is this questioning of the value proposition, because it's literally an existential threat to the future of higher education.
Thanks, Brian. I think both of you raise, I think, important issues. And as we talk a bit about the theme of today's session, we are seeing increased attacks on higher education, and specifically on the work that we do around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so I'm curious. I think both of you have opportunities to speak to folks in Washington, D.C. or in your states. If you're talking to a legislator, how do you communicate about both the value of higher education broadly, but specifically about the work that we do in DEI, in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
So I'll jump in and both respond and answer your question here. So first, in response to Brian, I couldn't agree more that if our colleges and universities don't get workplace culture and recruitment and their policies right, then all of that trickles down to impact how a college or university is positioned to serve students. And within that, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging is so important, and all of those questions need to be addressed and considered, because again, if they're not right, it's not going to be right for the students that we're serving. So to that end, it's all a part of the fabric as we try to solve these problems. To the conversation about the value of higher education, my first comment is I think we all have the conversation all wrong, and I wish we could hit the reset button. I totally agree that the price that students and families pay are inherent to this conversation, but some of the ways the conversation is being driven right now is way off the mark. And one of the first places I think we need to start is thinking about how much K-12 education costs. On average, states are spending $16,000 per pupil per year. And I think if we talked about that more, New York State is over $30,000 per K-12 student per year right now. And some states, many states are over 20. If we talked about that, I think students and families would realize, oh yeah, there is a cost to education. Teachers have to be paid, buildings have to be built, heating and cooling has to happen in buildings, and there is a cost not just to providing a quality education, but there's even more of a cost to providing a high quality education. And if we had that fundamental naturally in our heads, I think we would shift the conversation somewhat about higher education. And in fact, we might even get to the point that says, why aren't we paying more for higher education? Because at the end of the day, it's that good quality experience that we want. So thinking about the fact that K-12 is not free and expanding from that, we haven't answered the question as to whether higher education is a public good or a private good. And I think that's what's happened in higher education. We have, as a country, built a system where there is an inherent public good in providing K-12. Depending on which state you're in, those dials are turned differently. But when we get to higher education, we have built this structure where there is a very different approach to how we finance post-secondary education. And all of that goes to that question as to whether higher education is a public good and a private good. And if we can wrap our heads around the fact that it is both. If you get a certain type of higher education, you will be positioned, frankly, financially for different levels of income throughout your lifetime. But at the same time, most with some type of post-secondary education are going to have higher earnings over the course of their lifetime. They're going to wind up saving more for retirement. They're going to be less likely to be dependent on public services. They're probably more likely to volunteer in their communities and be engaged civically. They will be more likely to have fewer health issues the higher your education attainment level is. So all of that comes back around to this notion that that I feel like we just don't even have the conversation right, and somehow we have to get that conversation on the right tracks, and it's, in my opinion, just not on the right tracks anymore. Let me pause there and turn it over to Brian.
Great points, Liz. I love your point about the return on investment. People don't realize that the research is pretty clear that
Very clear.
earning post-secondary credential benefit. People who have college degrees even are in car accidents less. And so there are people often want to go directly to the financial benefit of higher education, but there are a whole host of benefits that accrue to the individual and society writ large. So I appreciate your point about it's both, and that's okay. And we have to convince legislators that an investment in higher education benefits the public, their local communities, as well as the individuals, or influencing the individuals and improving the individuals' lives through, or the community's lives through the individuals. And so, you know, the message that we try to carry to legislators about the importance of this, I think sometimes about talking about the lost opportunity or the opportunity cost if we don't act. Sometimes I think that message is important for legislators to understand that, you know, if we were to remove higher education or continue to not invest in the particular state or at the federal level, where could we be in 10 or 20 years? And I think sometimes that message, unfortunately, we have to, I think sometimes we live in a more negative oriented world, and we have to help people understand the lost opportunity if we don't act by helping them to understand how higher education is a driver for innovation and entrepreneurship. And we live in a society that is embracing innovation and entrepreneurship, especially as the workforce evolves constantly. The technology tools like AI will continue to make those two skill sets, innovation and being an entrepreneur, much more valuable and necessary in the future for future generations. So higher education is core and central to cultivating those kinds of mindsets and those kinds of skills. So we have to help legislators understand that higher education is kind of the crucible where the skill sets for the future are nurtured and cultivated, and look at the lost opportunity if we don't act, and where their districts or their states or the nation writ large might be if we choose not to.
When I think about some of those skill sets that are really valuable and vital for future generations, and we're going to get on our next panel to talking about students in particular, I think about institutions of higher education as places where folks are exposed to, engage with, have opportunity to attend programs in the residence halls, right, that give them a broader perspective. And often those come from offices like the one that I direct at Michigan State University that's focused on identity and affinity. But the value proposition of that is that those programs, services, engagement opportunities cost money, right? Can either of you talk a little bit about if a student said to you, why is going to college important, not just for the money, but specifically around this idea of engaging with difference and providing spaces and places for students to get an opportunity to have those, sometimes difficult conversations? What would you say if they're like, we're going to cut that whole program, or we're going to reduce the opportunities there, particularly around diversity, equity, inclusion?
Well, I would say that I'll start this time that, while we acknowledge that higher education, kind of the higher education industrial complex has definitely grown over the last 40 years or so, it's grown in ways that are necessary and that allow institutions to continue to serve better the evolving student population and their expectations of what going to college means. And so, I think that all of those pieces, I know that there are people who feel like, do we need diversity officers and the like? As a former chief diversity officer myself, who can point to and saw the benefits of those offices on the lives of students and the university writ large that I worked at, where I worked, I think it is totally valuable. And it's one of those kinds of background returns on investment that we don't see. Like we talked about the various benefits to individuals that accrue from earning a college degree. People want to go first and foremost to the financial benefits. Well, there are a host of other benefits as well. And I think that those kinds of college support programs and other supports and wraparound services that institutions provide to students provide some of those kind of wraparound benefits that individuals don't see up front, but that accrue to their lives and have an impact on them nonetheless. And not just those individuals, but the community by and large.
So I know there are many programs that are 2-year programs or even certificate degree programs that are post-secondary that prepare individuals for the workplace. But I say this next part referring more to a 4-year degree or deeper. When individuals complete those programs, typically they have learned to read well, write well, think critically, and solve complex problems. And to a degree that those, I hear that value conversation spoken about as if you're 23 years old, you're getting your job. Does it matter if you have that degree? Maybe, maybe not. But if you're later in your career, who's more likely to be promoted? The person with skills who can read well, write well, think critically, and solve complex problems. And to your question about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're going to be able to better solve complex problems if you are exposed to problem solving that involve deeply diverse communities and deeply diverse teams, because you're going to have more ideas that are brought to the table, more challenges brought to, and more questions brought to the issues at hand. And it is so fundamental to those basics that you come out of education with. But I'm also going to add a business office twist. I'm going to put that business twist on and just say, if colleges and universities don't figure out how to address diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, no matter what rules and strictures are overlaid on top of them, they're not going to meet enrollment goals in the next 10 or 20 years. If we look at census patterns, degree holders, if colleges and universities aren't warm and welcoming to Black and Latino students, they're simply not going to have students walking through their doors and helping them meet their enrollment and student success and completion goals. It's as simple as that.
Liz and Brian, thank you so much for sparking our initial part of our conversation today. I think this is really critical. We're gonna now actually transition to our time for our attendees to reflect on this conversation. How often do you get to go do that, right? Like, we're gonna take some time actually as a part of the symposium. Hopefully you have your attendee workbook. If you can turn to pages 10 and 11, or pages 17 and 18 in the large print edition. Liz and Brian have provided a few questions for you to think about, or if you're watching with a group today, discuss with the group. We're going to take about 10 minutes for y'all to review and reflect, and either on your own or with others. And then we will see you all in about 10 minutes. Thanks. All right. Welcome back, everyone. We hope you had some time to reflect on the previous panel with Liz and Brian. For the next section, I'm really happy to introduce Drs. Nolan Cabrera and Corey Seemiller. I'm excited to learn from both of them. They're actually going to engage with a conversation without me involved. Before I turn it over to them, though, let me give you a little bit of intro. Their research actually has some really interesting overlap, so I think it's going to be a great conversation. So welcome, Nolan and Corey. A little bit about both of them. Dr. Nolan Cabrera is an award-winning author and professor at the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona. Nolan was an expert witness in the case Gonzalez versus Douglas, the Tucson Unified School District's Mexican-American Studies case. So we're excited to hear from him. Dr. Corey Seemiller is a professor in the Department of Leadership Studies and Organizations at Wright State University, and is also the co-author of several books on Generation Z, including Gen Z Goes to College, which has been featured on NPR, New York Times, and Time Magazine. And also, fun fact, Corey and I worked together in the Center for Student Involvement and Leadership at the University of Arizona in the early 2000s. So welcome, Corey and Nolan. So excited to hear you all talk today.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks so much for having both of us. I know that we have, Nolan and I talked through a couple questions that we just thought would spawn kind of a conversation between the two of us. So, you know, maybe I can start out by just asking us this question, because we've really looked at it from different vantage points, but have come to some of the same kinds of ideas. So, you know, Nolan and I really want to look at how are today's students different from students 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, it seems like a really long time ago in some ways, but not very long in other ways. So, but there are some changes. So Nolan, what kinds of things in your research have you found that make today's students different?
Well, first of all, it's just an honor to be on this panel and in this company. Glad to be able, Corey, to be sharing this with you. In terms of how things are different, you know, it's kind of funny because once people of our generation start talking about the previous generation, there's a tendency to get kind of a curmudgeon, like, you know, get off of my lawn, you rascals. And in some respects, I actually think that students today have a lot more advanced and nuanced understandings of some really complicated issues. In particular, a lot of the student organizing that they engage in, it's almost a given that it comes from an intersectional paradigm, and I mean it in a very much a Kimberly Crenshaw oriented way of looking at those problems. They have a really strong sense of interconnectedness, and they're also so adept at using social media. And I know it's kind of a double-edged sword, because that, you know, you can just be doom scrolling till the cows come home. But I've also seen it where, you know, student activists can call a rally and get 500 folks in the span of an hour because they're so interconnected in these areas. And so the exact same areas where we tend to demean, they can leverage to exercise their own power, exercise their own voice in their own terms. And for me, you know, I know I've got a lot to learn from them, because when we were doing activism back in the 90s, it was handing out flyers and, you know, trying to rally folks and signing petitions, and there is something to that. But there's a level of sophistication and nuance that goes on in this that I'm really I'm both pleased and humbled to see. So then flipping it back to you, because I tend to come at it from more of an activist orientation. You have more of the broad strokes of this generation. What are you seeing in your research?
Yeah, well, Nolan, it's so fun to be able to talk to you. For just a fun fact, Nolan and I are literally right down the street from each other right now as we talk about this. We're both in Tucson, Arizona, which is super fun. You know, it's interesting. I've been watching and kind of following Generation Z since the oldest came to college back in 2013. And, you know, some of the things as a researcher, you look to see is if things change, right, over time. And there's not a lot that's changing with this generation, even with COVID sort of stuck in the middle. There are things that they were doing pre-COVID that they're still doing post-COVID. They're just maybe doing them a little differently. But I couldn't agree more with what Nolan is saying. This generation is very, very connected. Now, what's interesting about that is they're much more globally connected. So yeah, they can get a rally together like that. They can, I mean, you can have a movement on your campus, and then 12 campuses around the world are also having the same movement. And it's not even bounded by national boundaries, which is really interesting, or even national issues. You're seeing youth around the world that are actually doing activist things that are in support of things happening in countries that they're not even in, which is really a kind of a unique solidarity that they have in being youth and being kind of these change makers. On the flip side of that, though, is we see a lot more connection, but we see a lot less interpersonal bonding. So there's a lot of communication, a lot of ways that they're finding to support each other. But when it comes to having an everyday conversation with the person sitting next to them in class, it's like, ooh, I'm kind of nervous. You just called a rally of like 10,000 people around the world on Saturday, and you can't talk to like your lab partner in chemistry. And so it's kind of an interesting thing, because we sort of in some ways come to expect that this sort of outward external activist social media influencer that some of them really have taken on really kind of comes to more of an internalized everyday college student behavior, and it doesn't necessarily. So sometimes we see them in roles where they're a little bit, quieter or more reserved. But so when with the research that I've been looking at a lot of issues and what they care about. And I will tell you, the number one thing that continues to come up is, social justice, equity, inclusion, belonging, welcoming, being authentic, all of those kind of factors that we're talking about today. This is critical to this generation. And I can tell you what's different from 20 years ago is that it's more expensive to go to college. And while we say that maybe cost shouldn't be a factor, politically and, in a legal sense, it shouldn't, but in an everyday sense, when young people don't feel like they belong somewhere, they're not going to pay a lot of money to go there. And we just have to understand that there are lots of people that are not going to come. It is not Field of Dreams. And when college was much less expensive, you could make the argument that, well, just come anyways. You can just cough up a little bit of money. But now we're talking about people who are, taking out, debt against future payments that they don't even know they're going to have the income to do, to come to a place that they might not feel included or welcome. And so it really is a different day and a different age, even in a short time for 20 years.
And that's a perfect segue into the next issue, which is, given the realities that you and I just talked about, how do you and I both see higher education as a whole, colleges and universities in particular, needing to change to meet these needs moving ahead?
Right. I mean, what are your thoughts? I'm curious. I like piggybacking off of you because you have such
dang
great
it.
ideas.
I thought we were doing a serpentine. I'm gonna throw something out there, and this is going to be the obvious answer is that we need to be very aware that these institutions were not made for the demographics of students who are coming in right now. I mean, it's a very basic premise. You can't call it a land grant institution and forget about the land grab that occurred, and then try to, of indigenous lands, and then try to say, okay, well, now we're just going to incorporate Native students in it and have a land acknowledgement and everything's hunky-dory. It doesn't work like that. And so I think fundamentally we do need to have some profound and deep questions about how we sort of what the canon is of any specific area. If it is the traditional, dead white men, then we need to think about that in terms of who it is that we're teaching, who we're seeing as sources of knowledge. And I really think, and there's a really, this is I'm going to try to thread a really fine needle here. I think we really need to abandon the notions of meritocracy while concurrently maintaining a focus on excellence. And this is really hard to do, because when you say meritocracy, excellence gets thrown in there, and it's like we throw everything out. And I'll be honest, like, we can't. I think for me, meritocracy is about sort of the entitlement to resources based upon some arbitrary notion of what constitutes excellence. And unfortunately, the way that we do that, the way that we tend to operationalize that in higher ed, is basically whatever Harvard says, and we're all trying to chase whatever that designation is. Well, they had 3.9% acceptance rate last year. We need to get ours down below 75. It's like, we're never going to beat them at that game. Let's stop playing that game. I've been really happy to see people, institutions removing themselves from things like the arbitrary measures of the SAT and being a little bit more, removing themselves from U.S. News and World Report, because again, it's Harvard's game to win, period. We don't, let's focus those resources, like how many millions of dollars institutionally do we invest trying to chase these arbitrary measures of excellence, while concurrently saying, yeah, it's just a good institutional investment. Actually, it's not. And if we could actually focus more on educating our students and focusing on that, I think that that would be a really important step moving ahead, because then we could, instead of trying to chase an arbitrary ranking, we actually say what is in the best needs of our students and recenter that in the process, reinvest those monies in the process.
Nolan, I couldn't agree with you more. And when we talk about investing the money, it's funny. I speak at a lot of college campuses, and I talk about, particularly for this generation, and you could have made this argument for any previous generation, we just hadn't made it yet, is we need more support in mental health resources. And I will often have college presidents even come up to me and say, we don't have the money. And I said, yes, you do. You're just not spending it where it needs to go. Like, at the end of the day, you got to make some tough decisions. And I think about it like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you have a student who is, not having support for any kind of mental health issues they might be experiencing, while the tutoring center is great, and I'm not advocating to cut it, they're not going to tutoring because sometimes they're struggling with trying to even get on meds, get psychological help, get more counseling appointments than are offered on campus. And I think about when we're talking about supporting students, they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. And some of the things from our studies we found is not only are they concerned about DEI in how it impacts them, right? I might not have enough to pay for college, or I might be discriminated against because of my race or my sexual orientation, but they're also highly concerned about other people. And this continues to come up in our studies, is I'm really worried about just the state of higher education in general, and I'm the state of the world, and I'm worried about it. So when I think back to college, and the things I worried about were really different than the things that our students today are worried about. Where are we putting our money? We can take it out of some of these other areas like you're talking about, put them into mental and emotional well-being, put them into support services. We should be doing more of that. And again, I go back to this idea that, it's, if you build it, they will come. No, they won't. And as a matter of fact, this is a generation that is really kind of knocking the walls down. They are, they're not coming into college and just trying to change things here or there. They're literally saying, I'm not going to come, and I promise you, when I'm kind of old enough to figure this out, I'm going to make something that's better than this, because I think that we need a complete revolutionary transformation. That's what young people are saying. So are they going to participate in institutions that aren't changing and aren't meeting their needs, or are they just going to go create something else? Because look at it, Google Gen Z entrepreneur, and you're going to see all of the amazing inventions that they're making to solve problems that the rest of us haven't figured out yet. So that's what they want.
Yeah, they do. And it's so funny because when you hear talking heads on cable news, which, because I watch them all the time because I like having high blood pressure. If you're watching, it's always, this generation is so entitled. This generation is so entitled. And I'm like, yeah, they feel, God forbid, they feel entitled to a clean and healthy environment, affordable education, not having to deal with systemic white supremacy as a result of getting to get an education. They feel entitled to not be the target of misogyny. They feel, heaven forbid that they feel entitled to these things that are just, like you said, basic human needs. And I really think that there is something about that, and really, we're also seeing the after effect of pulling out so much of the social safety net that our generation, the generation before, took advantage of. And when there's no social safety net left, they're like, well, no, we really have to be vigilant in making these demands, because it's sort of like the way that Michael Franti and Spearhead talked about it, that the harder they strike us, the louder we become, just like the skin on a drum. And this generation is very loud and very intentional, and there are reasons behind it. And if we do not understand the reasons behind it, we are doomed to just perpetuate this generation, rah, 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 and all that stuff. And they're going to leave us in the dust, and rightfully so. So we need to play catch up with where they're at this point.
Yeah, I again, I couldn't agree with you more. And that's the thing too, is we're hearing about, particularly in the workforce, where, young employees, they'll graduate college, they'll go out into the workforce and they'll work, a couple months and say, I don't want to work this job. And then they leave. And then we get, all of us get up in arms like, oh, they're quitting, they're leaving, they're entitled. And it's like, they're doing what I wish that I had done when I was 23 instead of staying in a job that I hated, right? Like part of it is just kind of giving us older folks a reckoning. I remember I had a discussion with a faculty member one time about, he asked me if reading was still an effective form of learning. And I said, well, I don't know, is it? And we got into this discussion. He said when he was in college, he had to read 600 pages a week. And I said, well, how did that work for you? And do you remember any of it? And he said, no, not really. And I said, well, then, we're just evolving as humans to learn better ways of doing things. And so we have to let go of our own experiences that are like, we had to go through that. You have to go through that too. And I'm really glad we have a generation that's calling us on it and saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go into this institution if I don't feel I'm welcome and belong. I'm not going to, put up with this. I'm going to go somewhere else, or I'm going to build my own.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree 100%. So really, I think as we're coming down on the end of our time here, but there's always these prognostications, and I always struggle with this because people are like, look into your crystal ball 15 years. I don't know how to phrase the question. I don't even know how to answer the question. So I'm going to volley it over to you to see if you have any thoughts about that. What are kids going to look like in 15, 20 years?
In 15 or 20 years, they're going to be running the world. That's what they're going to. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? As we see the proliferation of technology continue to go, I mean, we're going to have social media platforms then that don't even exist now. We're going to have all sorts of systems and structures in place. But one thing we can depend on is the higher education is going to look relatively the same, right? It is the slowest moving, kind of barge. And for many reasons, a good one. We do have traditions that people rely on and things that work, but there are going to be a point in which the students move much faster than the institutions, and we're going to get to a point of reckoning with that.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I always struggle with when I ever get that question is people always, especially when it's around DEI work, is that, and I hear this all the time in almost a progressive echo chamber that, well, Dr. King said that, the mark of the moral universe is long, but it always bends towards justice. And that's actually one place, and respectfully, I disagree with the great Dr. King on that, because justice is a human justice is a human construction. It doesn't exist in nature. There's nothing that naturally is going to bend it. If it's going to bend, we are the ones who have to do it. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about this generation. Although there was a question in the Q&A about it, that is, are there some things about mob mentalities and students sort of misusing a little bit of their power. And yeah, I actually do agree with that to a certain degree, which is why, I rely very heavily on Adrienne Marie Brown's "We Will Not Cancel Us." But for me, it's kind of like one of these situations of, I don't really think that a lot of folks who have been silenced for so long, when it comes into these collectives, realize how much collective power they have. And so they're doing this organizing, they're doing this work, and they don't realize how hard they can hit at this point. And I think one of the things, as social media becomes just sort of the norm and the generation is developing on this, I'm hoping, not guaranteed, but I'm hoping that especially in activist circles, that it reaches a certain level of maturation where people understand this is how we critique oppressive systems, and at the same time that we don't hurt each other in the process. And that's just it seems part and parcel to coming to reckon with new technologies, new ways of being, and it seems like that's part of that evolution. But it's not going to naturally occur. We have to be there in lockstep with them, supporting them in it, because at the end of the day, this is engaging in larger protracted struggles. Because at the end of the day, really, I think we've kind of lost sight, even in this conversation, that we are talking about impending fascism coming into the country, and I don't use that term lightly. I mean, I was watching the debates earlier this week. We may say we don't want to cancel us. Every person on that stage overtly wants to cancel us. Like, there is overt calls for censorship, for bannings, and it's already structured into law. And sometimes we forget about that, and also understanding that there's an incredible power when theorists around issues of tyranny come to come to the fold, they start talking very clearly about the need for critical thinking and the critical role of university life as a method of proactively upending tyranny in this process. And so I think that there's an incredible amount of potential here, but unless we actually activate it, it's just potential energy. And we actually need to do something with it. And that's what's both exciting and daunting, because the future isn't set. The future is what we make it.
Great. Thanks, Nolan. Enjoyed the conversation.
That was wonderful. Appreciate you, Corey. I do wish we had gone to Revolutionary Grounds and actually had the conversation in person, but best laid plans and all that good stuff. But
So yes, thank you so much, Nolan and Corey. At this time, we invite you to turn to pages 12 and 13 in your workbook, or 20 and 21 in the large print workbook version. Nolan and Corey have provided some reflection questions that we invite you to respond to either individually or with your colleagues. Please use the next 10 or so minutes to do so, and then after that, we do have a break scheduled for 15 minutes so that you can kind of take a little bit of break, and then we'll be back in about 25 minutes. Thanks.
Anna, I have to ask, is that the jacket?
It isn't. I do have it right over there. I thought it was a little much. I'm just really cold right now.
Folks are coming back from break going, what are they talking about? Yeah,
I
it's
know. I don't do well above the 23rd latitude, like so.
I'll go back off camera so you can do your intro stuff. Hello, everyone.
Okay.
Welcome back.
Am I starting?
Yep.
Okay.
You're good to go.
Okay, thanks a lot. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming back. And I want to take a brief little moment to say that I wanted to thank Nolan, Liz, Brian, and Corey. They have raised some really interesting points and issues that I think will certainly come back to our Q&A session at the end. It is my great honor to present and help facilitate the conversation that's coming up next between our two participants and you. I'd like to first introduce Dr. Bridget Dwyer, who serves as the inaugural Vice Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Dwyer has over 20 years of experience as a practitioner, scholar, and teacher addressing issues of equity in higher education. So welcome, Bridget. Thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Great. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Paulette Granberry Russell. Paulette is the president of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. Many of you know her from her very, very long time and incredible work at Michigan State University, where she served as the senior advisor to the president for diversity and equity. And I know that she now has the title of emerita at that position. As an attorney, she's a practicing attorney, in Michigan. Granberry Russell has led the MSU's efforts to advance its equity programs, and she continues to engage in activism around making and creating and extending and entrenching and supporting and scaffolding equitable and inclusive campus communities. So I welcome you today, Paulette, and thank you for being here today. Well,
My pleasure. Yeah.
oh, it's okay. The mute and I, we seem to love each other. So let's start with Paulette. Paulette, recently, you all have released a State of the Chief Diversity Officer report. And I know that many of our colleagues today who are online are either chief diversity officers or involved in those offices on campuses or engage in some version of that work. And I wonder if you could share with us what you think the top takeaways for us as higher education practitioners and scholars are from that report.
Sure. And let me first extend my appreciation for the invitation to be with my esteemed colleagues as a part of this panel and this symposium. And Dr. Shea and I have, our paths have crossed at Michigan State University, so it's really good to see you, Heather. And as you mentioned, for those who may not be as familiar with NADAHE, I'm just going to state very briefly, we're National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, a membership organization. Our goal is to act as the voice for senior diversity officers, diversity professionals, diversity scholars, and researchers in higher education. And in February, as you mentioned, 2023, we commissioned our inaugural State of the CDO survey. And when we had planned to do the survey, it was prior to the intensity of the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts had started to as it was escalating. So our goal was to collect data to inform a clear picture of the demographics, institutional roles, and socio-emotional state of CDOs across the country, and obviously to use the data to support our members. And it was released, as I mentioned, just as the legislation started targeting the DEI efforts. I made that mistake. I don't use the acronym any longer.
That's
So I say diversity, equity, inclusion. It takes a few more breaths, but I will not make that mistake again for obvious reasons that I think some of you know, that they've weaponized the acronym. So the survey went out just as things were becoming more intense, and certainly a lot of greater scrutiny through media with respect to the work that was going on. Key takeaways. And I think this is important in this context, especially as you think about who's being particularly targeted for these efforts to dismantle the work. Demographics. The majority of those who responded to the survey, almost 52%, identified as Black or African American. 11.5% identified as Latina. Almost 9% are white, 7% Asian American, 1.5% indigenous, and nearly 63% were women. Most were between the ages of 35 and 54. And think about in the context, we were asking specifically for responses from individuals who identified as senior diversity officers or chief diversity officers, not more generally or broadly, for example, unit diversity officers or practitioners in the field. So nearly, as I said, most were between the ages of 35 to 54. Nearly 63% were the first to hold this role at their institution, and not quite 88% have held the role for 5 years or less. Think about that. All right, not only in terms of age, but the fact that many of them, the majority, were the first to hold this role at their institutions and for 5 years or less. So if we think about 2020 and the so-called racial reckoning and the speed with which our institutions as well as corporate decided to establish inaugural roles, I think that is a reflection of the data that we have, and it basically solidifies what we knew from our own experiences. So many identified that part of their concerns, they were understaffed, under-resourced, and having been in that role and have been active with NADHE over the last 17 years, that's not anything new for us. And they felt that way when compared to their previous jobs. They also found this job as a chief diversity officer more fulfilling and much more stressful. In addition, positive terms like, again, fulfilling, satisfying, and rewarding were highly rated choices, along with, of course, overwhelming and upsetting. Few found their work manageable or predictable. And for someone who had been in a role similar to my colleagues for 22 years, all of those things, I think I'd have to attest that those were my experiences as well. And yet we found ourselves committed to doing the work. What the data confirms is that those doing the work are also those whose passion, commitment, expertise, and lived experiences are now targets of oppressive and draconian laws. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Bridget, if you can reflect on that in relation to what you certainly see at Penn, but also saw at Princeton before, because that was your previous position where you served in a similar position. How does that resonate with what you're seeing and then what's going on in your space?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to start by again giving thanks for being here. It is really a wonderful opportunity to be in conversation with my colleagues, and it's great to be on this panel specifically with Paulette, because I've admired her work for years, and I've been a member of NADHE for, I don't know, over 10 years, and so I remember my first NADHE. All the participants were in one room all the time. All of the sessions were there, and what a difference it was this past spring with, hundreds and hundreds of people filling a ballroom. And so I think it's just a testament to the amazing work that you've done at NADHE and to the statistics and the data that you just shared about the growth of these roles, their relevance today, and the people that are taking up this work, which is both joyful, meaningful, and really difficult and painful. So I think that, you know, what I wanted to talk about right now was not just the demographics and the responses to this survey, but as you mentioned, Anna, kind of what I'm seeing on my own campus, and you know what I'm experiencing, and particularly in the landscape of the legislation, and what I'm finding is a lot of confusion. In my current role, I'm working very closely with faculty and a lot of faculty hiring work. We're really making a big push at Penn around inclusive hiring practices. And you can often hear me saying, inclusive hiring practices are oftentimes just good practices. It's just, did you read everybody's application? Did you spend the same amount of time with everyone? Did you not ask illegal questions, right? A lot of these things that seemingly may be basic. But what I find myself talking a lot about with our search committees is particularly the affirmative action SCOTUS decision that came out, that comes up over and over again, and people are asking about how it's connected with hiring. And I have to remind people, it's not. The SCOTUS decision is about admissions. It's about admissions. Historically, we were allowed to consider race as a part of many components in looking at college admissions, and that is no longer the case. But hiring has always been a different conversation. There is applicability around, not applicability. There is, we can increase the pool of our applicants, but we cannot say, I'm going to hire this person because of their race. That is illegal. We cannot do that. We can couch our conversations in saying, this is the demographic of our college student body. We are located in this particular, city or location. We're maybe a state institution. We have an obligation to serve a particular population based on our mission. And we want to hire somebody who has the skills and experiences to serve our population. And that might be a person with a minoritized identity, and it might not be. And so I think the landscape is just so thick right now with so much going on legislatively, that there's a lot of confusion, whether that's SCOTUS, whether that's, laws that are happening in Florida or in Texas, or things that are kind of bubbling up in a lot of other states and conversations. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done. I often say, unfortunately, I feel like I have some job security. I mean, I used to say that. I feel like I have some job security. Now this landscape is like a whole different thing. But I say that I have job security, and that there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot that we really need to wrestle with. It's legislative, it's care of people, it's care of students, it's care of our staff, which oftentimes isn't talked about as much. But it's really developing a community of care that's really important. I'll pause there.
Bridget, thank you. And you raise, I think, one of the most important aspects of the conversations around sort of the aftermath of the SCOTUS decision, and where we're all sort of spinning and swirling and et cetera, et cetera. And that is this issue of confusion, right? I certainly see it on my campus with graduate admissions, undergraduate admissions, faculty searches, et cetera. And maybe I'll give a cheap plug here for the ASH conference in November. We're going to spend a day with 2 different presidential panels working through the legal aspects of what this means for higher education, and then the practitioner panelists coming in afterwards. So I encourage all of you to take a look at our webpage for those 2 presidential sessions that we've just stacked together. But this would be a good time, Paulette. There is a lot of confusion around where we are now in a post Supreme Court decision, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, and how that then would engage all of our practitioners in certain questions about their practice. Now, certainly the obvious places are in admissions, right? And I think that most institutions now have rolled out all their university councils and
have certainly, I think, focused their education around admissions, but there's a lot of confusion around all the other aspects of the institution around this decision. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, let me try and address it this way, because I think for a lot of people, what is happening is the swirl, not only with respect to the Supreme Court decision, but also the broader efforts to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout higher education. And when you think about the playbook, as some of us describe it, and the 4 pillars of the playbook that is being used as a model for legislation, one of the 4 included the elimination of so-called preferential treatment in admissions in higher education. And so you have a Supreme Court that, was successful in addressing one of the 4, what I call pillars to dismantle this work throughout higher education. So you attack admissions, for example, and as a result of that, there's a lot of discussion with respect to the broader application of that decision. And thank you, Bridget, for clarifying for others that that case is not intended to address anything but admissions. But, I think institutions must be very careful in the context of understanding that the issues raised in that case were constitutional. Title VI, federal, which is how Harvard as a private institution got drawn into it. And then the 14th Amendment with respect to equal protection and public. So they've gotten private and public institutions that are now having to resort to race neutral approaches to their work. But understand that at least 9 states currently have bans that cut across all aspects of the work. And now you have this confounding legislation that is attempting to extend, not only with respect to admissions, but much of our practices related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But you got to also be clear that what that model legislation has done through its attacks on the elimination of mandatory diversity statements, the elimination of mandatory training, professional development around so-called DEI, and then finally the dismantling of DEI bureaucracies. They're going for the whole ball of wax, as I say.
Right. And I'm sorry, but I think you wanted to jump in, and I may have cut you off. No? Okay.
Nope.
Thank you for that. And I'm struck by the fact that one of the real sort of ground zeros here for us as researchers and practitioners is the coming together of this intersection of federal policy and then state legislation, right? And to what extent, really the Supreme Court decision was an ideological one because it didn't really rest on precedent that the court had said before. So you have this ideological swirl as you characterize it, and then you have the state legislation, and it has hit both private and public. And in private institutions like Penn, for example, how are you seeing that? Like, how is that confusion real to you, and how is it that folks around campus are what kinds of questions are they asking you, and where do they seek resolution to those questions?
Well, as I said, I think most frequently I'm seeing questions about hiring getting looped in with this. But I think it goes to the broader piece that is really rooted in what Paulette said in the beginning about not saying DEI and saying diversity, equity, inclusion, and taking it deeper. I often say DEIB plus, right? Because our language is often evolving and changing. And so leaving the door open for how the field is growing and what we need to attend to, I think is important. But even drilling down within each one of these words and letters, is distinguishing. I'm going to give a shout out to all. I saw there's some folks here from Michigan, other dialogue folks giving shouts out. You know, I saw Go Green. I'm gonna go Blue in the chat. But you know, my work, you know, being rooted in dialogue, there's this framework that we often utilize, which is PASK. Passion, awareness, skills, and knowledge. And I think a lot of people, both, I will say both in and outside practitioners and scholars who are, who may fashion themselves diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging folks, may just rely on their passion. They don't drill down and become skillful. They don't drill down and impart the knowledge, because all of this confusion, I think, is rooted in the fact that people are lumping everything together. They're not getting specific, right? Admissions is really different than hiring, is really different than student care, and student affairs work is really different than academic affairs. And so to just lump everything together is a reductionist approach. And so I think we need to, you know, stop. We keep responding in the weeds. And I think I was actually at a great presentation at the last NADHE with Liz Cole and Tabby Chavis, who were talking about a lot of the work that they've been doing at University of Michigan. And they were talking about all of the queries that they've been getting about, you know, how many people fall under, you know, DEI practitioners, you know, they're getting these from the outside. And I've heard this not just from them, but for others. And they're kind of pushing back and saying, well, everybody, or, well, you say it's 100? Well, actually it's 500, you know, and so kind of meeting the question with a totally different reframing. And so I think that's kind of what we have to do is maybe we're not responding to the questions that are asked, but how are we telling our own story in a way that positions us not to get into this back and forth? You know, one of my mentors would always say, data informs, but stories convince. And we've got, I know Nolan was talking earlier about and Paulette was just talking now too about sort of the playbook and the strategy that's being implemented to dismantle the current state of things. And a lot of that is rooted in these wild stories, right? It is not only just inaccurate and not factual, but we categorize that as not just misinformation, but disinformation. Right. And so we can't continue to respond to disinformation with accurate data. That's not going to resonate with people. That's not going to resonate. We have to respond and we can't just directly respond. We've got to flip it and come at this at a different angle and tell our story in a really effective way.
Paulette, I think, please respond to that.
Yeah, just one quick one, because I think Bridget has hit on something that for me, having to speak more publicly on this, because I'm not currently tied to an institution, because of the impact, the chilling effect that this is having, and people's ability to speak out, including university presidents and boards. It's your point about communication and being able to, the narrative has been hijacked. I've said that publicly. And what we've not done effectively in higher education is speak more directly to audiences outside of higher education. And that includes the adults and the families of our students. It includes community-based organizations that care about this work, whether they are community-based social justice organizations. We haven't been able to convince the legislatures that this work is not the threat. It's not a form of indoctrination as being portrayed. And so NADHE recently released a communications guide whose specific purpose is to speak more plainly, if you will, take it out of the academy and be able to give a tool not only to our leaders, but to our governmental affairs folks, our communications people, because they have to help better communicate the story, the commitment, the values, the mission of our institutions, as well as how we can perhaps use it to speak more broadly about the work and the effectiveness of what we do, and the imperatives that really speak to the value of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in higher education.
Well, we could go on for a long time and it would be awesome, but my alarm just went off telling me that now we have to ask our participants to please turn to page 23 and 24 in your workbook. and take a look at those questions and respond in your workbook on your own or with your colleagues. And we're going to do that for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll regroup in 20 minutes for all of our panelists to come together for a Q&A. Before we do that, I just want to give out a special thank you to both Bridget and Paulette, but they're going to come back and help us finish up our session in a little bit. So we get to your workbooks, and we will be back in a little bit.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm going to have everybody bring their cameras on. Hello, hello.
Hey, Brian and Jason, for some reason I'm not allowed to start my video.
We will fix that.
Got it now. Thank you.
Okay, there we go.
I wasn't
What about
taking offense. I wasn't taking offense.
What about Corey? Corey, are you still there? Oh, there we go. Good, good. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Wow. I am astounded, blown away, just really grateful for the conversation that we've had today. We're now going to enter into a time period of the full panel talking to one another. We've gone from kind of where we are to where, our students are and where we're potentially going. I'd love to hear from each of you about some of the connection points that you drew, and points of inspiration from our conversations today. And I've put in the panelists chat, which I know not everybody has their chat on, a suggested order. And Nolan, I have you starting us off.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Wow. When the president's voluntold me, you step up to the plate. All right. So I think a couple of core things that I'm thinking about. Number one is that we have to be vigilant about being able to defend higher education. And that can actually create a bit of a paradoxical relationship for BIPOC folk, because in reality, higher education hadn't always loved us. It's been kind of this unrequited love, but in many respects, in order to exercise our academic freedom to talk about things like critical race theory, gender and women's studies, we need to be able to defend this institution and concurrently critique it and improve it. In order to do this, it very much feels like we have to be multilingual I don't mean it in a literal linguistic sense, but being able to speak to multiple audiences. Because I've heard issues coming up about state legislatures, and let's just say that my sometimes brash attempts at influencing the public discourse don't always necessarily go along those lines. But I think that there are multiple ways, and I think there are multiple tools that we can do, and multiple stories, especially building up what Bridget was saying about the different ways of articulating the value that we have. I don't always feel comfortable talking about the return on investment in higher education, but you know what, that's a real thing. And at the same time, we need to be able to say very clearly how so many of these attacks on higher education are actually manufactured crises. They are problems in search of solutions and not the other way around. And there's a very strong continuity that this has been going on since the 90s and even before that. These cultural wars where it's just, oh yeah, what can you do with a degree in gender and women's studies? It's always either ethnic studies or gender and women's studies. There are two area studies that always come out. And we have to be really clear about flipping the script on that, because in many respects, that also gets coupled with an issue that got brought up in the chat about cancel culture. And in many respects, we have to say that no, these are actually areas that are expanding our opportunities in higher education to understand more holistically this human experience and our endeavors as human beings in higher education. And at the same time, this repression is actually the foremost form of cancel culture that we've got. And so collectively, and I know we were talking about this a little bit before this whole session started, ultimately we have to have each other's backs. We got to be able to say that if there is an attack that's happening in Kentucky, it still is something that's happening that affects me in Arizona. If it's very easy, and I'm not going to try to rag on the coast. I'm saying this is more of I'm saying like this is a collective responsibility. If you're in a place like a Cali, like a New York, like a Oregon, like a Washington, where you're not constantly under attack, you're still under attack, don't get me wrong, but you're not constantly. take advantage of that time to forge those connections, because the solidarity across these differences really empowers us. And concurrently, if we get siloed and isolated, we will perish in our own isolation. So those are the different connections and thoughts that I had going across that. And now I'm going to take my heart out my throat and put it back in my chest, because you put me on the spot like that. So thank you.
Thank you, Nolan. I would love to hear reactions. And next we'll go to Paulette.
I have to unmute. Nolan, aside from the fact that you were our closing keynote speaker in April, and you're encouraging us to have each other's back, there's no truer words that have been spoken. And for me, the inspiring part of all of this, whether it is being in the space with all of you, but also in the space of people who still give a damn, about this work. And the fact that folks are understanding, to your point, Nolan, the necessity of us forming coalitions. And I think some of that is going to have to be informal, but it has to be formal as well. And I think, when I think back over the last year, and if I think especially about the last 9 months, there were very few organizations speaking out, particularly within the Higher Ed Association family. And now, I think as a result of some of us being more vocal and being out front, others are starting to come along. We all understand that we will perish together if we don't. And that means we have to have a strategy. We have to catch up. We have to commit ourselves to it. We have to amplify student voices. And I, some will say that backdoor agitation. To Nolan's earlier point today, and to Corey's point, these students, they're ahead of us. Our bureaucracies, quite frankly, I think sometimes have been more of an impediment to the work, including the ability of our students to lead in the places where they can lead more effectively than our bureaucracy. So I'm in spirit with all of us who care. I think for me, the only if I think about the other part, you talk about inspiring. I think you use something, that for a minute had me thinking, what's the downside of all of this? Well, I know what the downside is, but I think lifting ourselves up, self-care is also very important. So, and our institutions have got to, our leaders have got to lead better on this. 2024 legislative session is going to be hitting us in January. And if we somehow think that they're settling down, no, the opposition to this is, they're fired up, and we have to be equally inspired to do what needs to be done.
Paulette. Liz, do you want to go next?
Sure, yes. Wow. There were so many comments here along the way that I wanted to dig into. I wanted to jump in and ask more questions. I guess a few quick reactions. One, I loved the comment about how emotion is driving conversations. And I think it's so true that we watch what's happening with DEI and think it's happening everywhere, but it's not happening in every state in terms of the policies we've seen in Florida and Texas. I think with emotion and the SCOTUS decision, I think unfortunately a lot of people translated that into all higher education policies and not just admissions, and that's a real problem. But I think it goes other ways as well. I think emotion gets involved in the cost of higher education questions, which are real, but has turned into questions about the value of higher education. We have to be very careful about that. I loved in the chat here, I saw some comments about state funding for higher education, and I also saw comments about the data and following the data. Yes, let's do that, and let's talk about how state investments in higher education have shifted after public higher education enrolled more women and more underrepresented citizens at state institutions. Let's look at that data, pull it out, and show the evidence of how that has shifted in public higher education in the United States. And then lastly, I really was fascinated by the comment about how students today are highly concerned about the global condition, but maybe a little more challenged with interpersonal skills. And if that isn't a case for a deeper investment in diversity on campuses, I don't know what is, because we need communities sharing personal backgrounds, life experiences, and different perspectives. So those are my main takeaways from today's conversations.
That was like the perfect segue to Corey to talk a bit about that. Corey, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I really enjoyed all the different perspectives. It's been really fascinating. And, you know, especially when we talk about some of the structural elements of higher education versus kind of the dynamics of the things that we can do on a day-to-day basis, right? And I look at our students today, and you know, in modern history, it's amazing to see how far we continue to move the institutions away from what the students need and want. And so when we see things like state funding being cut, and we see things like, you know, policies coming down the pike, and, you know, particularly if you followed things with like the new college in Sarasota, Florida, and things like that, you're going to see an exodus of students. You just are. It might not be tomorrow, it might not be next week, but this is a very powerful contingency of students, and they have resources that none of us really had, right? They have social media, they have technology, they have the ability to mobilize, and they have a voice. And it's interesting because over time, we've seen things like cancel culture get canceled, right? Like this idea that cancel culture is somehow harmful. But think about it. It came from a kind of, in many ways, a youth movement of a group of people that didn't have money and didn't have voting power. And canceling was about the only thing that they could do to be heard. And so we also have to get on board with the fact that youth are doing things, and young people and young adults are doing things differently than we have done them. And their activist movements might actually move the needle in the direction that might be more progressive, more inclusive in the things that we're talking about. But we are going to get to a point, we're going to get to a crossroads when at some point we understanding, not us, but pretty much lawmakers understanding that students pay tuition, and they're not going to pay for something if it's not what they want. And that's divestment, which we're seeing a big, huge movement of divestment among this generation. And divesting higher ed is no different than divesting a particular product. But secondly, they are voters, and every minute of every day, somebody is turning 18 years old. And we have to remember that this voting bloc is very, very socially progressive. The question is whether they come to the polls, and they have been in 2018 and 2020. And even 2022, will they continue that movement? We will see a shift. We don't want to sit back and say, wait, let's let the young people take it from here. But we also need to know that as educators and working in these systems, that we can empower and create pathways and opportunities for young people's voices to be heard in ways that can move the needle, in addition to the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Corey. Bridget, what do you think?
I agree with everyone. There's been so much rich conversation, so many wonderful quotable things that I've written down and have just been thinking about. I'll just mention a few of them. Liz, I really appreciate what you shared about the invisibility of the cost of K through 12 education. And I think placing that in contrast with the very public conversation about the high cost of higher education was a framing I hadn't thought of before. And so I really appreciate that. And it helps me think a lot about how we communicate about higher ed and how we need to communicate about the cost of K through 12. And so that's a really big takeaway for me. And then I guess saying on that same thing, you know, Corey, you talked a lot about not a lot, but you mentioned that there's a need for mental health services, and that, you know, presidents or leaders will say, well, we don't have the money for it. And it's about, you know, shifting and thinking about how we can make the money, or, you know, spend the money on particular things. And And while I agree with you, I also think this is really complicated. I think it's really important for those students out there who are in higher ed programs to dig into higher ed finance, if that's an option for a course for you in your program of study. Budgets are moral documents, and so we need to look closely at them and understand where our money is flowing. And we are in an increasingly litigious society. And as Paulette mentioned, there is a strategy to distract and have us spend our higher education money in particular areas, so we do not have the funds to spend them in areas that really matter. And so I think that those are things that are really important for us to think about, and to have this radical imagination about how we can, as I mentioned this earlier, not respond to particular attacks and reframe our conversations. So we have to be, it's that creativity that we really have to connect with and apply it to, I think, all of the different components that we discussed earlier in this panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Brian, your kind of thoughts on connections and points of inspiration.
Well, thank you for that. I don't know if being last is a good thing or not, but I would say that I would echo Bridget's point that while I agree, I definitely agree with Corey that every institution has money to spend on mental health initiatives, and New Jersey's putting its money where its mouth is by investing $26 million in ARP funds to fund mental health, a mental health initiative over the next couple of years. And so, but I also know that it is really complicated because every institutional president, CFO, and leaders, if you talk about if they have to take away resources from somewhere else to put on that, the people who are going to be affected by that are going to be banging down their doors, asking, why are you taking away my funding? Why are you firing my staff? Why are you removing these faculty? And so it is going to have to take some courageous decision-making by leaders in higher education. It is very complex and complicated. I would say lots of good things that I've heard today. Corey, I do agree with you for sure that in 20 years, higher ed isn't going to look dramatically different. I got into higher ed in 25 years in the mid-90s, and there were all these prognostications about how higher ed was going to change and the great retirements that were going to come. And you know what? Even through the midst of a global pandemic, what did we immediately start doing as soon as we moved from the pandemic? Go back to instructing and operating our campuses the same way we did previously. I mean, there's more online learning, yes, but for the most part, we went back to mostly in-person instruction and operations. So in 20 years, higher ed, I think some things will change more so with the way that we instruct students, because I agree that students are the drivers here. The young people will make us the marketplace. They will make higher ed shift how they operate in some ways. So I think some of that will change, but I don't know. I mean, campuses are still, I'm actually on a campus today that is for a ribbon cutting of a multi-million-dollar facility, a $50 million facility that they're still building bricks and mortar, despite the fact that we're talking about more online learning. So higher ed isn't dramatically changing. And so one of the things that I like Nolan's point about the interconnectedness of youth is, how do we help those youth to get more engaged, the next generation? Because I do think we're going to have to rely on them to change things. People our age and older are set in their ways, and things aren't going to change dramatically until we get some of the next generation involved. And how do we incentivize them to put pressure on some of these legislators? Because the one thing that legislators, federal or state, don't want to hear is that someone's going to run against them and possibly take their seat. Their primary goal in life is to get reelected. And so if some of these young people can get engaged and bring some of that pressure to bear, I think you'll start to see the needle move. And so I'll wrap things up there. But also to Paulette's point about the playbook, this whole conversation about the value proposition, and that's my soapbox. I get on that about the whether or not college is still worth it, because the people who I think is part of the playbook, because it's connected to these DEI challenges. There are lots of people out there talking about, do poor people need to take out so much student loans? In the meantime, they're sending their kids to college.
That's right.
Their kids are still going to college, but it's a question about whether or not certain people should incur so much debt to go to college. And so I am on the front line saying that people, that higher ed has to innovate and reduce costs. We have to reduce costs. I tell the presidents here in New Jersey that all the time, but I also think that we also have to convey the importance of continuing to go to college and the return on investment for those who would most benefit from it, those who have most been left out of being able to participate fully in it. So that's my soapbox, and I'll get off of it.
Yeah, no, you can stay on it with me. I think, Heather, am I on now? Sorry, I'm trying to follow the script a little bit.
You're good. You're good.
Okay. I do think that at the core of this is this very, 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 in my mind, insidious and pernicious narrative around that's, driven by privatization, ideology around the free market, et cetera, that, somehow or another, let's just go back to some people will be, trained in vocational trades. Sure, they'll make money, but they won't be as valued or given status in the society because they don't go to college, right? And it's an insidious narrative because who's going to wind up there? People like me, people like you, right? And, the last time I looked at, the immigration demographics, we know who those people are going to be, right? And then so you sort of recreate this, sort of late 19th century, early 20th century narrative that was very, very powerful for the elite and for the elite classes that were racialized. So I think getting back to a point that Paulette raised around the playbook, et cetera, to me, a big takeaway from here is the real need for coalitions of higher education constituencies, whether they be varying institutions, all of our professional organizations, our communities, the Boys and Girls Clubs who do college admissions, application help services, et cetera, to get square on the narrative, because the narrative that's being tossed around and really perpetuated around this whole issue of cost isn't really about, leveling, quote unquote, the playing field or giving access to marginalized populations. It's quite the opposite. And that's what makes it insidious. So I support I think that's been something that's really been at the core of much of our consternation around how to shift and how to mold the playbook. So I really appreciated that, Brian. And now I'm being the dutiful person that I am. I have to get back on script here. Because one of the things that also didn't come up, which should have come up is, well, I guess it did come up a little bit. And I do think that it came up with Paulette's comments and also Bridget's comments around how it is that, the stresses and the personal tolls on staff who are engaged in our multiple institutions in a variety of different ways, whether they have a DEI title or not. It could be our university counseling staff. It could be our support staff for athletics, or our support staff for departments, and certainly student affairs. Very often those frontline workers are often marginalized identities have or hold marginalized identities themselves. And I wonder if folks could just give us a couple of thoughts on, gosh, given the Nadahi report on understaffing, under-resourced, more stressful workplaces, how do we attend to those ways in which this creates a particular personal toll on our colleagues? And Bridget, would you jump on in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to on that. Thanks, Anna. So I was actually going to talk about something I believe Heather and I had a conversation about on a podcast. I was fortunate enough a few months back to talk with Heather on the Student Affairs Now podcast. And we were talking about a book that my colleague Latanya Buck and I had in a chapter in the book, Becoming a Diversity Leader on Campus, and it's edited by Eugene Parker. And Latanya and I had a great time. It was really hard. Writing a book chapter during a pandemic with our staff was leaving was really difficult. But I think we're both very proud of that piece. And it was very intimate conversation. Essentially, the way the piece is set up is a kind of a conversation like this between the two of us about some of the successes and challenges of becoming a diversity leader. And the story I wanted to share was one that I talk about in the chapter, where there's this time where a couple institutions ago, I had a role, and there's this mantra of, the reward for good work is what? It's more work. So I ended up having teaching. I was a full-time administrator and I was a faculty member, but I was an adjunct. And so I found myself teaching actually more classes than full-time faculty. So my days, I think 1 or 2 days a week was essentially a 9 to 9 schedule. And then the students, there was this thing on campus that happened, and I was mentoring these students, and we needed to find a meeting time. So I met with the students at 10 p.m. And I had this moment, and I had 3 kids. I just had my youngest. He was 1. I think I was still breastfeeding. I had this moment where I said, this is not okay. This is in no world is this okay. And so it wasn't okay for me personally. It wasn't okay for my family. And it was not good role modeling for the students who said that they wanted to go into DEI work, because I was demonstrating to them that this is how you do it. And that is not okay. And so I take those lessons to really create boundaries for myself. And I've had this great privilege of being in this role at Penn for the last 2 years. And I've taken that learning and the learning of, a lot of other things that have happened throughout my career, in trying to be very intentional with setting boundaries and trying to be empathetic with the staff that I hold, the staff that are in my office. And really creating some programs. So the scope of my role is that I'm interacting with everybody in our school. So faculty, staff, undergraduates, maybe not as much as a heavy touch, but faculty, staff, undergrad, graduate students, postdocs, right? Portfolio is huge. We're the size of a mid-size. Our school is the size of a mid-sized university. And so I try to be really intentional about creating community and places and opportunities for staff, and asking our department chairs and saying, our staff do a lot of work, and naming them and inviting them to professional development opportunities, and putting into my budget opportunities for them to attend trainings on faculty hiring, because they're doing a lot of that work behind the scenes, about having an opportunity for them to come to a lunch and learn and say, this is intentionally for you about our procurement, right? We have a mission not only of serving West Philadelphia, but also around supplier diversity and making sure that we're reaching women and people of color owned businesses. And so who is doing a lot of that purchasing? It's going to be our staff. Who are our staff? Our staff are disproportionately women and disproportionately people of color. And so providing an opportunity to say to them, you get a free lunch too. You get a chance to step away from your desk. You have the right to eat and eat in peace without multitasking. And you're also getting some information about how to support our local businesses. And maybe that's maybe you have a sister or a cousin who has a business and you want to introduce them into the supplier diversity initiative. So I think it's really building in these kinds of different ways and opportunities that I try to take the learnings that I had from the past and set up some really intentional situations. And we have this mantra, last thing I'll share is that we have this mantra in our office is, our informal mantra is, we're doing the best we can. And we said that it's gone from needing to be a t-shirt to maybe, and we say it so much now, it needs to be a tattoo. But we really mean it, right? So we're giving ourselves grace at every step of the way and saying, all right, so we didn't get to that extra email, but we're doing the best we can.
Great, thank you. Liz, in these last 2 minutes, can you what are you hearing on the score from the NACUBO folks?
I'm sorry, on the score,
Well, and how is it that we attend to the toll that many of these stresses around DEI hit marginalized populations on our campus, staff, administrators, faculty, financial officers, etc.
Yeah, I have to say, I think we're in the first phase of shock and awe. I think we still have business officers who are kind of looking around and realizing just the extent to which mental health exploded as an issue for them, for students and for faculty and staff. And look, I'll be honest, we're talking about a lot of people who love to bury their heads in bed in spreadsheets and Excel files. They haven't met, an Excel file they haven't loved. And so we are at the beginning of a learning curve, but I guess what I can say to you is NACUBO's been very committed to making sure mental health is a major part of the conversation. Our closing plenary session at our Planning, Budgeting, and Analytics Forum was on mental health and what's happening with college students. So but I can't deny that we don't have a long road ahead.
Great, thanks. Heather, I think I pass it off to you.
Yeah. So I'm really thinking a lot about the ways that folks have shown up in the chat today, and just want to raise up some of the phenomenal questions that we have received from folks as they've kind of taken in and made meaning of this panel. And so I wanted to transition, actually, before I ask my final question, to one of the questions in the chat, because I think it does get at a solution, right? So my colleague Jody Lindley asked a really specific question about leveraging community leaders and resources, particularly when the university is constrained or unwilling to work on DEI initiatives. And so I'd love to hear folks' thoughts on ways in which we might do that and partner or support some of the community-led supports for our DEI work. Who wants to take that one?
I'll throw something out there since people are reluctant to speak up. As a former chief diversity officer, and Paulette and I worked together years ago when I was at Ohio University in her role as at NADOE at the time. I relied a lot on community officers because it was in southeastern Ohio, a very red part of the state, the reddest part of the state. And within that part of the state, there was this little blue dot, and that was Athens, Ohio. And so there wasn't a whole lot of appetite for diversity work on the campus. But one of the things, I saw the need to actually go out and engage with the community to, one, help the folks who provide services in the community, like bus drivers, police, and the like, be more thoughtful and considerate of and supportive of this very diverse campus that was in the middle of their environment. And so I was able to secure support for a diversity training program, and actually even had a town hall on diversity in Athens. And so I think that employing community leaders can be a great way to kind of provide a little bit of a jolt to what's going on campus, but also to get even greater support in this kind of broader area, especially in these areas where people aren't necessarily supportive of that and simply see these campuses as these kind of liberal bastions that are isolated from the local community.
To kind of piggyback off of that, I think also we don't need to recreate the wheel. The essence of ethnic studies from its inception in the 1960s was meant to bridge that divide between the community and the ivory tower, and to make the ivory tower actually work for the grassroots, not the other way around. And so if you're struggling to find models of how to do that, assuming that you have, and this isn't a safe assumption, but if you do have a thriving ethnic studies program in your specific college, university, I'll bet you dollars to donuts that there are people who are already doing this work. And frequently it flies very much under the radar. These aren't necessarily the partnerships that are put out there because it's not a $5 million NSF grant. But the models are already there. And in many respects here in Tucson, that is exactly what led to the creation of the very much basically the highest impact Mexican American Studies, Ethnic Studies program in the K-12 environment in the entire country, was exactly that. And it was basically saying, how can the university be at the service of the community, and then in particular, how can the teachers be at the service of the larger community as well, and all of us working together in that way. And so the models are already there. Just, I think it's more asking the questions of who's doing the work and not assuming a blank slate in the process.
I'd like to piggyback off that too. I think when you come from like a student perspective, think about how many service learning and internship programs we have in higher ed, and think about where our students are engaging in their work, right? Helping match them with causes that they care about. We're literally mobilizing teams of students throughout the nation to be able to do work. We're giving a lot of nonprofits are under-resourced and understaffed, and could certainly, benefit from a student connection, and a student would obviously get developmental and growth out of their own experience in doing service learning. So we do have the capacity to create pipelines to help match students with causes they care about, which we know many of them have to do with diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, other initiatives like climate change. I mean, climate justice is tied to diversity, equity, inclusion. We know this stuff. So how do we help students sometimes find these spaces? Because what happens is, particularly ones that leave their own communities, they come to a new community, they don't know those organizations, they don't know where to find them. And then we have like Service Saturday, and then we take them out and we do something like a park cleanup, which is really good and important, but these students want something where they can create massive social change. How are we helping get them connected to the organizations that are doing the work? So we're not recreating the wheel, but we're mobilizing potentially thousands of students into our communities to help with the work that they care about.
That gives me a ton of hope, right? And I think that's part of the message that I'm also hearing from all of you. But Corey, let me stick with you for just a moment, because I think what I'm hearing in that is that there is hope in this next generation. What about that? What gives you critical hope for the future?
I love the passion of so many of them. And sometimes I find that there's so many choices and so many options for them to be engaged that sometimes they step back and they're not engaged at all. And what I think is this is one of the most compelling and important times to be an educator, because not only are we dealing with the forces kind of above and around us, but we have such a motivated group of students that want to make the world a better place. And I'm inspired by that. And I've actually been accused of being a generational optimist. And I say accused because people say you look at their potential and you don't want to, tell all the bad things about them. And I'm like, but as an educator, that's my role. That's what gives me hope to come to work every day, is to know that there are students that want to make a difference. And my job is to help get them connected to the networks and the opportunities, and help them develop skills and powerful experiences to do the work that they want to do. And so I'm just inspired because they inspire me every day.
Anyone else want to respond to that? What gives you hope?
I go back to the Freudian notion that hope is an ontological need, that without hope you can't do anything. And that's distinct from optimism. As well, shout out to the Student Affairs Now podcast about critical hope. Yeah, that's a great way of seeing it operationalized. But any student of history will look at the enormous odds that my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation went through, and it would be a disservice to them to say that the odds are too high right now. They're too stacked against us right now. That if oppression is an extension of our our fallibility as people, and so they're necessarily incomplete. There are always cracks in the walls of whiteness. There are always cracks in the walls of capitalism. There are always cracks in the walls of ableism, and it's incumbent upon us to figure out ways to actually change them creatively and boldly. And if we don't see them, it doesn't mean that they're not there. It's that we're not close enough to the problem to see them. And so I believe that hope has to be sort of an a priori assumption of everything that we do in this work. And it has to guide it, and not just sort of, oh yeah, things will get better, but then that becomes a moral calling that we are forced to actually make them better in the process.
Anna, I'm going to turn it back over to you to pick a question from the audience that you might want to ask. Don't forget to unmute.
Here I am, unmuted. There was one that I thought was, yeah, so, I mean, and jumping off of, Nolan's call for thinking about notions of hope and optimism, which to a pragmatist like me, potato. But thinking much more practically about how to actually get at state legislatures, and in what ways, and how to, I guess it's this issue of disdain for the enterprise of higher education, back to this narrative question. But I do think that there's a coalition and a practical piece to that maybe Brian can help us with, because there have to be some real tangible steps that we can all take around state legislation. And what would you encourage us to do, Brian?
Well, I think being in this role for almost 3 years now, and after working at 5 different campuses, I've come to realize how much of higher ed, we often think about the federal landscape, but really the work in higher ed is done at the state level.
Yep.
And influencing the state legislature is a strategy that I would encourage everyone to be mindful of. As I said, that they're all they want to do is get reelected, and I think most of them go there with the intent of, they have good intentions initially, and then they get co-opted if they're there long enough. And the idea of there's some people whose minds you aren't going to change, and you just have to simply accept that. But you have to work in the margins with the partners who are willing on both sides of the aisle, because what I found, and I've heard this from other state folks as well, is that the rhetoric isn't as charged and loud at the state level as it is at the federal level, unless you're at a place that gets a lot of attention like Florida and Texas. Right. And so the idea of finding people I'll just be blunt and honest that this is really a Republican issue, finding people on the Republican side of the aisle who are willing to be supportive. We have some Republicans here in New Jersey, and part of that might be because we're a place that has a supermajority where Democrats control the state house, the governorship as well. But there are Republicans who are willing to work with us on higher ed issues. So this is one of those places that isn't as charged as Florida or Texas, but developing a strategy where you employ the local advocacy groups, because they're often connected to those legislators' home base, and bring them along with the institutions as well. And get some of these students out there to develop some of these grassroots movements that Nolan talked about, to help them understand how this is an issue, and help the legislators, or this is an issue that they care about, and how legislators need to be voting in a way that is aligned with their constituents. Now, there are some legislators who, like I said, you're not going to change their minds, because the dark side of the double-edged sword of gerrymandering, yes, they protect their districts, but then they're beholden to that population. Right. Even I've had one Republican in the state who said, my district isn't, secretary, I agree with you, but my district isn't going to go for this. And so that's, part of what you have to wrestle with. But I think in many states, you can find some champions on the other side of the aisle. Now, they're not going to be loud and vocal about it, but you can find some champions who might be willing to help move the needle a little bit toward supporting some of this work in a quiet way.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I do think that it is, it's imperative for us to realize that higher education in the United States, and this is, higher education 101, isn't compulsory. And we're beholden to this notion of the states controlling the vast majority of it, and thus its funding is tied to that. And it's supposed to be doing the good of the state. This is the proverbial public good of the state. And state legislatures are, I think, ground zero for that. And I really appreciate your comments. Thank you.
I think Bridget was going to say something.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Bridget.
It's totally good.
good.
I just wanted to jump in on this. I appreciate, Brian, what you were saying about the state level. I think that's so important. My current institution, my previous two have all been private institutions. And so I think there's also this, there can be this tendency to kind of try to opt out of the conversation of like, oh, it doesn't affect us in the same way. No, it still does. It still very much affects you. I'm in Pennsylvania, which presently has a Democratic governor, but you never know what could happen next election, right? So it can really change the situation in which you're in can really change. And so I wanted to make a comment also kind of connecting the previous conversation about getting in touch with community and really working with community organizations and connect it to this point that Brian made. And this is just an example. So there's this organization in Philadelphia and Greater Philadelphia called POWER, Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild. And so it's an organization that is based in education and racial justice. And they've been able to get help to get advocate for raises for people working in the airports, and kind of have been lobbying for an increased minimum wage, and have also been looking at educational inequity within the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is actually 50 out of 50 in terms of looking at, and it's been a while since I've talked about this specifically, so excuse my terminology if I get it a little bit off, but essentially it's 50 out of 50 in terms of if you look by race. There are some of the biggest disparities within the state of Pennsylvania by race in terms of districts. And that's often surprising to people because I think it would not be Pennsylvania. But all of this to say, and one other thing that this organization does is talks to people in local districts and says, hey, and it's also a faith-based organization. So says, hey, we go to church together, or we go to the same synagogue. We care about education. We have a faith connection. And so I want you to vote faithfully when I want you to advocate and think about your faith when you go to the polls. And so I think it's this interesting piece around this kind of radical imagination about how do you get to an issue that in a way that is totally different than you might imagine. And again, 2 institutions ago, I worked at Villanova University, which is a religious institution. And so the opportunities to also connect the mission for those of you, if any of you are at Catholic or Christian institutions, consider what leverage that might provide for you in terms of the angle of justice, in terms of the angle of, the mission of the institution.
Yeah, great points. It's for me very familiar now to the move, the parent coalitions to unban books, right? And it has that feel for it. Heather, I think that I'm looking at my clock.
I know it's hard to believe we are always running out of time on the podcast that I host, and undoubtedly we have great people, lots of great things to say. I have a couple of concluding remarks, and Anna, I think you do too, and then we'll turn it back over to Jason and Brian. Nolan, you mentioned Kari Grain and her book, Critical Hope. And I just want to lift up a particular quote from that I shared actually in my presidential address. I said, or Kari Grain said, hope alone can be transformational, but in moments of despair or when you're up against profound injustice, it isn't enough on its own. Hope without action is at best naive. At worst, it tricks you into giving up the power and agency you have, the very power and agency to change the systems that cause suffering. That quote just really spoke to me. And as I've thought about, both this topic today, as well as the conversation that we've all engaged on, I've really thought about power and agency and addressing systems and issues of injustice. And so the dialogue has been fantastic, and I hope that it doesn't end here. And I hope those of you who are engaged in dialogue with colleagues, you know, in a watch party, as my colleagues upstairs in Michigan State are doing. Thank you to my intern, Josh, for hosting that today. I hope that you continue the conversation to build these coalitions within your spheres of influence, because I do really believe that that work on a collective level will have the opportunity to change the systems of oppression. Anna, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm, I have the very hopeful and optimistic and confidence in higher education that I think many immigrants have. I've benefited from it. I think its demise is greatly exaggerated. I think we will evolve, albeit somewhat slowly, but it takes, the good work of, institutions, people, and, our collaborations today is just one small moment in that type of action. I think that I'm hoping, at least I've got a couple of pages worth of ideas here that I hope today our collaboration has developed, we've been able to develop a long list of practice research coalitions within our institutions, outside of our institutions, between our professional organizations, our community organizations, because the panelists today have reminded us all of our true north on this score, right? And quite frankly, the journey that's required to get there. And like I can see all the ways in which they've littered, the breadcrumbs on that journey in a myriad of ways. And now it's really up to each of us to figure out how to make those coalitions work with those communities inside and outside of our own institutions. So I think that they've told us very politely to get to work, and I think we should. And I want to thank them all for doing that.
Well said.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for being part of this really great panel. 3 hours somehow flew by very quickly on a fall Friday afternoon. I say fall loosely. We were talking about weather earlier. But just thank you all for being here today and for being part of it, to our panelists, to our attendees, to Heather and Anna for your leadership and your vision for this session, this time today. That's become a really great partnership between our organizations, ASH and ACPA. I do want to remind you all that we will be sharing out the recording with all of our attendees today, probably in about a week or so, but we will be getting that out already, or out in the out soon. Brian H. and I are also going to do a very shameless plug about our upcoming conferences. So our ASH annual conference is being hosted in about 7 short weeks in the home of Prince in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Really excited to be back out there. We've had some really good meetings out there over the past few years, and just really excited to be back in Minneapolis and be together with our ASH community. And then in the spring, Brian?
Yeah, so in the spring, ACPA 24 will be taking place from March 18th to the 21st in Chicago, Illinois, which is actually the location of the founding of our association, and where we are going to celebrate our 100th anniversary as an association. So registration for both of these events and these great learning opportunities is open, and we hope that you will join us to continue these critical conversations. Thank you again so much for joining us today, and we are wishing you all the best as we continue to navigate this time together.
Thank you all.